Okay, everyone. Well, as folks come in, we just like to get started because we have incredible content today in a short amount of time to present a very important webinar. I want to welcome everyone to part one of a three-part webinar series, Courageous Conversations, a series on race, equity, and justice. My name is Isabel Perez Marina. I'm the president of the Florida Association of Community Corrections and the CEO of Advocate Program in Miami, Florida. Before I open today's courageous conversation, getting comfortable with the uncomfortable, understanding explicit bias, I want to acknowledge and recognize the board of directors of FACC and specifically thank and acknowledge the education committee members, Gary Chappelle, Joe Lipsy, Suzanne Caldell, Assistant Secretary Joe Winkler, Jeff Nichols, Jeff Bassikalupi, Justine Patterson, Tammy Shemmy, Tucker, Tony Deaton, Sherry Monroe, Shauna Murray, and two excellent dedicated board members who secured our two featured speakers today, Linda Brooks from Orange County Corrections and Kathy Lake from the Department of Juvenile Justice. This team education committee is led by Michael Anderson, who has, with all the trainings that he's brought to you, has led an excellent and phenomenal team to put this webinar in place. I want to thank all of them for their dedication and hard work. The education committee has worked diligently, but not without our challenges. We have to acknowledge that these are difficult conversations. Our board is an inclusive and close board, and we experienced our own challenges based on our distinct roles, perspectives, biases, and experiences. We work through those challenges by focusing on our mutually desired outcomes, by being open and transparent, by listening to each other and pushing onward. And that's really what this is all about, what we're asking each of you to do today and moving forward. We're living in extraordinary times. The death of George Floyd has sparked an unprecedented movement for change. We owe it to the many who have unjustly lost their lives, to the good men and women in uniform, to ourselves to seize the opportunity provided. One of the most effective interventions in our toolbox as professionals when working with offenders is thinking for a change. And today we ask you to hone on to those skills that we teach and model. Engage in active listening and be open to understanding the experiences and perspective of others. Check yourselves, your cognition, engage in self-change, and work together in an improved way to solve the problems before us so that we can achieve our mutually intended outcomes of treating everyone equally, fairly, and with respect. Before I introduce our featured speakers, I wanted to just go through a few housekeeping items. First, we have allotted times for a question and answer session following the speaker presentation. Please feel free at any time during the presentation to send in your questions. We ask that you go ahead and send those through the chat to Michael Anderson or John McMahon. You could send those again throughout any point in the session. You could also post them to everyone, but if you send them directly to John and Mike, we'll be sure to have them and we'll be using those to have an interactive question and answer towards the end. Second, be mindful that you're able to override our settings, turn on audio and video. We ask that you do remain on mute and out with the video turned off throughout today's webinar, and this will allow for the best experience for all participants. I've enabled the setting for speaker view, but again, you're able to select your own view. For the best experience, you could hide non-video participants and select speaker view. If you have any technical difficulties, need help with the Zoom platform, feel free to chat with me, John, or Mike, and we'll assist you the best way we can. So I want to go ahead now and introduce our two featured speakers, Max Epstein and Assistant Chief Probation Officer Omar Bowler. Max Epstein has over 20 years of experience in corporate and the public arena. She holds a master's degree in planning and public policy from Rutgers University and a bachelor's of arts degree in labor studies. She's taught conflict and conflict resolution in the workplace. She's grown up, like many of us, in a multicultural environment from Panama and with influences from many parts of the world. She's a tenured speaker in training on the topic of bias. Assistant Chief Bowler is originally from Detroit, Michigan, a product of a single family home raised with 6 brothers and sisters. He has proudly served in the United States Marine Corps, beginning at the age of 17. Served for 20 years, having 2 combat tours as a Marine. And after retiring from the Marine Corps, he continued his service to the public and began his second career with the Department of Juvenile Justice. He's a leader with extensive experience in our field and with this topic specifically. Max Epstein is going to take us through a historical perspective so that we have an opportunity to understand where much of our thinking has originated. And Assistant Chief Bowler will take it one step further and go through how we can define and identify a bias within our lives. FACC is proud to present these excellent speakers today. And without further ado, I want to introduce Max Epstein.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Isabel. This morning, we're going to be talking about implicit bias, and as Isabel mentioned, we're going to look at it from a more historical perspective. I'm a believer that in order for you to understand where you are today, you have to understand what happened in the past, and in order to move forward, you really have to understand what's going on today. What are those influences that makes us what we are and create some of the situations that we're living with today? So what's the definition? I went out and looked at implicit bias, right? You note that I made some statements here that same issues, different names, same names, different definition. We've been grappling with some of these things for many, many years, and we call it, inequality, racism, all kinds of things. But the University of Ohio, the Kirwan Institute on Race and Ethnicity, talks about implicit bias as a social cognition of attitudes or stereotypes that affect the way we understand things, affect the actions that we take, and the decisions that we take in a very unconscious manner. Others will say is your entire environment. What did you grow up with that made you the person that you are? As we know from children, our parents tell us certain things, our community, we go to school, we hear other things, we look at the media. We get a lot of information that actually form the way we think about things. So I just want to start looking at some very basic things. I always like to go back to history because I think it's very important. So let's talk about historically, right? We're talking about some political issues that are taking place today. We had a slave trade in America, right? 1525, 1866. Over 12.5 million people from Africa were brought here. Less than 4 million survived, right? But I want to tell you something that's not on my presentation right now because I'm not going to read every single thing that's there. You had explorers that came to the U.S. way before this period of time. You had Africans that were here from the 17th century, 1500s, exploring Latin and South America, the northwestern part of the United States. So some of them were already here. Then we get to 1607, when we start dealing with the settlements in Jamestown. And what was happening at that period of time is we had a lot of Europeans that were coming to the New World. They were escaping some very vicious wars in Europe. They wanted something different. And we have heard, some of you might, some of you have not, about indentured servants. And indentured servants were people who came to the New World. Their passage was paid. They were promised certain things once they got here, their labor for a certain period of time. But we also had that in 1619 for Africans, for Black people who were here. They worked alongside whites together. They were 4 to 7 years under contract. At the end of their contract, they were able to be free and buy land, or were given land, and they were given corn, and they were given other things to give them a start. Only issue here was that if you, Black or white, ran away or didn't do your job well, they could extend your contract, and it was very, very harsh. For women, it was even worse, because if you got pregnant and they didn't want you to get pregnant, remember, we're not talking the age of birth control back then your punishment was even harsher. So we get to a point in time when we get to this African indentured servant called John Castor. He went to court because he felt that he wasn't being treated fairly, wasn't being paid fairly, and he lost this case, and he was declared a slave for life. But I want you to know, from 1619 to about 1641, over 20-something years, blacks were not slaves. They were indentured. Some of them actually were able to secure their freedom. They had lands, and they had indentured servants themselves. But from an economic perspective, the landowners were a little bit upset that even the Europeans that came over were also becoming a problem for them. Why? Because they wanted to be part of society, and they were challenging the status quo. So how do you make sure that you retain power? You can identify a black person, an Indian person, a mulatto person. So we started identifying people based on race. Prior to that, that was not the case. It was just labor. Can you do your job? Yes or no? So we end up with a system starting in Massachusetts and going to Virginia, where we started enacting these slave laws so that they actually had no rights at all. Then we get to 1857. We have the Dred Scott Supreme Court ruling. Federal government cannot regulate slavery in territory. 1896, the Supreme Court solidifies that with Plessy versus Ferguson, right? A legal basis for explicit segregation in American society. So we're talking politics now. We're talking the age of an economic need. Now I want you to remember that we had the American Revolution in 1775 through 1783. What was that all about? We don't want to be slaves. We don't want to be under the power of a foreign country or a foreign entity, and that was the British Crown. 1861 to 1865, what do? We have civil war. Most people think it was because of slavery. No, it was the economics of slavery and maintaining the status quo. North and South, push and pull, and keeping the Union together. So I mentioned something else here about Senator Henry Clay. By the way, very well known, the Act of 1850, when we had California trying to come into the Union and Washington, D.C., they did not want to have slaves in those states. How do you compromise not having slavery in those states when we have slaves in others? And they did, by the way. It avoided a conflict in terms of having free states versus slave states. But I only bring him up because he had a slave called Charlotte Dupois. She was a slave for someone else when he bought her. And she exerted that she was entitled to be free, that there was an agreement that her prior master was going to let her go. She actually went to court when she moved to Washington with the senator, and he fought very, very hard to keep her, and he won his case. She had to be returned back to him along with her husband and 4 children. So slavery was ingrained in our fabric of this country. Now we look at what have we built, and I'm talking about blacks, that really a lot of people don't give them any credit for, right? And we love our founding fathers, but we know that they were also slave owners. Some of the writers of our time, Francis Scott Key, he was a slave owner, so was Aaron Burr. We built Mount Vernon. We built Washington, D.C. We built Monticello. All of these areas that people go and visit, and they're in awe of how beautiful the structures are, how well built they were. They were built by slaves. Never got paid for what they did, and most of them didn't get any recognition. Systemic injustice from 1880 through 1950. An African American was lynched more than once a week for some breach of the racial hierarchy that existed. I will tell you that I'm an immigrant. I came here to the United States in 1969 as a child and witnessed what I have never seen in my own country, how there was the segregationist way that was happening, by the way, not just in the South. Everybody thinks it's just the South. Happened in the North, New York, Massachusetts, all of these areas. And I understood in 1969 into the early 70s, there were still lynchings happening in the state of Florida and in other areas of the country. So then we have a great migration. Everybody thinks, oh, all the blacks are just leaving the South because they wanted a better opportunity. That's really not the case. They were leaving the South because they were fighting to preserve their lives, and they didn't know any place else to go. That 90% of African Americans were living in the South, right? In 1970, 47% were in the North and West. But they were fleeing. Everybody has heard of James Earl Jones. We recognize his beautiful voice, his acting capabilities. 1935, 4 years old, fleeing Mississippi on a Jim Crow train, trying to get to his grandfather who was in Michigan. Mother left, trying to get a better life for her and his siblings. He ended up traveling by himself, fearing for his life. From the age of 4 to the age of 12, he was actually a mute. He couldn't speak. The experience of what he saw as a child, and we can relate to that as parents. If our children suffer something when they're young, they never forget it. And it was because of a teacher who looked at him and started coaxing him to read poetry is how we ended up with the James L. Jones that we know today. I want to talk about 1919. And again, I know a lot of people say, wow, that happened so long ago. Well, John Lewis just died, right? He was part of all of this, a sharecropper's son, doing things to try to make a better society for all, not just blacks, but for all. And he was still alive. He just died, and so are others dying. But the history and the story is still the same. Elaine, Arkansas, you had white soldiers called by the governor and white vigilantes that they went ahead and had them armed to kill 200 black sharecroppers. And what was the reason? Because they complained about their low wages? So you massacred everybody, women, children, and the men. Nobody went to jail. Nobody has been brought to trial. Quite a lot of these things that happened throughout the U.S., these individuals became our senators or Supreme Court justices. They became presidents of the United States. And so when you talk about the systemic inequality that people feel and the anger, you have to go back to history to understand why individuals even react the way they do. So now we're looking at the past, right? We have emancipation of blacks, supposedly, right, after the Civil War. You end up with Jim Crow laws. How do we keep people in place? We make them sharecroppers. How do we keep them from voting? We put poll taxes. They can't read. They can't write. They don't even understand what's going on. So now you, once again, make sure that you're keeping the status quo. You segregate the schools. You segregate neighborhoods. How did we do that? Government mandated segregation of American cities. Started with Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, then into the 1949 Housing Act that encouraged white movement to the suburbs, right? Unconstitutional racial zoning ordinances. I can talk about that because I'm a planner. I lived in New Jersey. And I would say that most of the cities in New Jersey, when they would zone property, they would make them large zoning areas, very expensive, because we want to keep those people who don't make what we make or look like we look out of our neighborhoods. Black inventions. They couldn't. They created a lot of the things that you use today that you don't even think about, right? You cross the street. That was a black invention. You have shipping containers. That was a black invention. So many things they were not able to even go to the patent office to take credit for what they did. We marginalized black soldiers in the military, right? When they came back from World War I, World War II, they couldn't even access some of the programs that the VA had available at the time. Actually, they allowed the states to manage that. And in the southern states, you can forget if you were going to get any kind of benefits, even though you served your country. Redlining, you couldn't get loans. Very difficult to get loans for housing. It's not that they couldn't afford to buy it. Nobody would give them a loan at all. segregation in transportation, the exploitation of Black women's bodies for science, right? Corporations also do the same thing. We have a president that one would consider pretty good, except he did some bad things. I mean, because of Woodrow Wilson, we kind of ended up with some things that were very good for the country. But what did he do? He passed a law, or the House did, right, on racial intermarriage. It became a felony in the District of Columbia. And then he ordered the offices in Washington to be segregated, with the Treasury and the Navy following suit. This was purposeful. This was political. It was economic. So we got to start thinking about, when you ask yourself, why can't those people do better? Well, you've heard the song, nothing from nothing leaves nothing. How can I do better? I started with nothing, and you keep taking away every little avenue that I may have to do better in life or as a group. And so in the 20th and 21st century, we look at a different dynamics, right? Northern manufacturing, pay differences between blacks and whites working in the same job. Black workers were able to work in the auto industry, specifically the Ford Motor Company, hired a lot of black workers. Very dangerous for them, some of the areas, because they were put in cutting areas. They went into meat packing plants. They were in foundry departments. So it wasn't really pleasant. 1910 and 1920, many unions, and in the North, again, this is why I say it was not just in the South, banned and barred membership by black workers. By the way, I was a union member. I believe in unions, even though I'm an executive today. But I did see some of the disparities when I was in the union and became a representative of workers in the company that I worked for. By the 1930s, we have better inclusion, of course. Then we get to 1954. Supreme Court decision in the case of Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. And that's when the Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation of schools was unconstitutional. But look at how many years it really took to enforce that, to actually allow a people, a person, the ability to get educated. It should have no bearing on what race you are or what color you are. But here we are. Here are some things that you would see and hear in corporate America today, and I'm sure you've heard it in the past. I can tell you my own experiences. They spend a lot of money in super PACs supporting certain political individuals. And they do it depending on the company because they want to get some favorable legislation. What they don't see is that the people they're supporting or influencing or lobbying actually are writing bills that affect us as human beings, right? You have no employment protection, housing, social programs. It affects our communities. It affects funding for schools, everything that we as individuals need, not just blacks, but all of us. I mean, because they're poor blacks, poor whites, poor everybody. You know, we just look at cities and we think it's only those people that have everything. Travel enough in this country and outside of this country, and you will actually see the suffering that people are going through today because of governmental politics and political legislative laws that they put in place. If you work in places like maybe in I don't know, in institutions of government or in corporate environment, you know, you hear certain things as blacks are dangerous. They're anarchists. They're lazy. How could blacks be lazy? They built this country for free for over 400 years and are continuing to build it and never really got any compensation for the suffering that they have had to go through and the communities that were burned. Sanford, Florida. I can name 100 other places where you have thriving black communities and businesses that were burned, literally burned down, and the people that were part of those communities killed. Or you hear things like, don't get defensive. Why are you getting defensive? Or if you're a foreigner like me, oh, you're not like the blacks in America. Why are you saying that? Divide and conquer, try to make me feel that I'm better than the blacks here because I speak a different language, and to you it's more palatable. So these are the things we have to be careful about. I bring these things up because in my own career, I've had people that report to me. I've been a top executive. I always check myself. When I am talking to a person or an employee, the first thing I say, Max, are you reacting because you have a good reason to react, or is it because you have a bias towards that person? Are you feeling uncomfortable? Are you jealous maybe? You don't like the fact that they're doing things a little bit better? I go through those checkpoints. Why do I do that? Because I don't want to keep anyone from being able to progress and reach their full potential. I took a master's class at Rutgers University. It's where I graduated from. And my professor was married to a man who actually led the School of Social Work in New York City. And she started talking about her maid. And she talked about her maid like she was a 2-year-old child. Well, my girl does this, and my girl does that. This lady was at that time 60 years old. She was black from the Caribbean. And I had to ask her, why do you refer to an adult as a child? She's not your girl. She's an employee of yours. And she looked at me like, how could you be questioning me? Very simple. And the reason why I did that is because a day before that, she talked about a black student and a white student who were gifted. And the first thing that she said was the gifted white student would always succeed. The gifted black student will never succeed. Boy, that's a pretty, wise statement to make. And I said, well, why do you say that? Well, the black student who's gifted, he comes from a poor neighborhood. What does that have to do with anything? If you're gifted, you're gifted. It's how you apply what you have. So the white student was rich and the black student was poor. And as far as she was concerned, the gifted black student would never go anywhere. Now think about that. Think about children in a classroom hearing those negative thoughts. How could they succeed? Think about how you may be speaking to an employee or a coworker, whether you're a police officer, whether you're an officer for the state in some other capacity, even in your own private world. I listen to people say to me, I'm not prejudiced, but they will never invite you to their house, right? I'm okay with black people or Latin people, but then you hear these jokes that are told, and immediately if you react, here is what I would hear, and I've heard, even in my community, I'm just kidding. I don't think they recognize that they really weren't kidding, or maybe they don't recognize the history behind the reason why the individual may be reacting to what you're saying. It's not because they're against you. It's because systematically, economically, educationally, we've had these situations that are so deeply ingrained. How do you get rid of it? And people ask me that question, Max, how do you get rid of implicit bias? Well, as far as I'm concerned, you got to get rid of on the political end, educational end, economic end. And then you have to look at yourself personally. And you have to say, if I haven't traveled outside of my community, then I don't understand how other people live. If I only know what my parents told me or what I see on television and never research what you're hearing, then how could you change? You really have to look at the totality of it all. What laws, what history, what economic disparity do we have in play that makes it difficult for everyone to participate equally? You're never going to get rid of it. Impossible. You're never going to get rid of poverty. You're never going to get rid of hunger. But you know what? You can work towards, what do we say in America? Towards a more perfect union, towards a more fair educational system. And for those who are educators, and I did a lot of work in New Jersey, with the schools in Trenton. Florida's the same. Most states in this country are the same. Schools are funded by property taxes. If you live in an area where property taxes are high and you've got expensive homes and a lot of businesses, the schools are going to be great. If you live in an area where, the property values are low, you don't have a lot of commerce going on there, your schools are not going to be funded the same. So here we are, separate but unequal. How can a child learn under those environments? By the way, I am not saying that there's no responsibility. Parents have some responsibility too. You have to advocate. So I will leave this here. I'm hoping that people will start thinking about implicit bias and what they do in their world so that they can make some changes as they go along. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Max. I really hope that we can all hear the passionate presentation that was just given. Part of what we talked about early on was being open to the perspective, the experiences, and really learning about the experiences that we might not know about, the historical perspectives that we might not know about, can help us better understand the thinking and where folks are at today. That leads us now to our next presenter. See here. Thank you, Assistant Chief Bowler. If you could go ahead and take us now into the next piece, getting comfortable with the uncomfortable.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I want to first start off by saying thank you to the Florida Association of Community Corrections. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with this group today. I also want to say thank you to Max for that historical presentation, which is a jumping point from what I'm going to talk about. So we're going to further the conversation about implicit bias, and today's, I guess, events, if you would, has sparked the conversation.
Hey, what's up?
And I'm specifically talking about the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. They have put us in a situation where communities have poured out in the streets to try to figure out what's going on, has branched out to conversations that we've never had with people that we've never spoken to about it. Conversations that we're revisiting, like the third stanza in the national anthem. Colin Kaepernick's decision to take a knee. Defunding the police. What is violent protest and what is peaceful protest? Confederate flags and statues. I mean, these are topics, polarizing topics that we're talking about today. We're talking about the similarities of the death of Emmett Till and the courage of the mother to allow an open casket. We're talking about the similarities between the beating of Rodney King that was captured on video. So now, here we are again with a polarizing incidents that have caused us to have these conversations. The one thing that makes it more ripe today is that we have a multi-coalition of folks that's really engaged in having this conversation. It makes it wonderful what it makes it. But I would be remiss if I didn't pay respect to a gladiator in the game, in the civil rights game, and that is John Lewis, who literally once got his skull cracked during a peaceful protest. John Lewis once said, "If not us, then who? If not now, then when?" I think we're at another moment in time where it's now. And I think we should recognize that. And I think we should bridge the conversation beyond presentations and sit down with each other with rules, with respect, whether it be on social media, whether it be in person, to have these conversations. It's okay to be afraid. It's okay to look at situations and want to know more. I think it's excellent that we're having a conversation about getting comfortable with the uncomfortable, because this is an uncomfortable time. This is an uncomfortable situation. So how do we do that? I mean, I hope to share a couple of things with you. And the first thing I hope to share is my definition, what I saw as a definition, a complete definition of implicit bias. And then how that bias may influence our decision making. I hope to share how we can learn to recognize some behaviors that may suggest differential treatment. And then learn some specific techniques that will help us de-bias perceptions and allow us to improve our interactions as supervisors, as community people, as leaders as a whole. Before I do that, I want to do what is known as a palate cleanser. I want you to watch a video. I'm actually not going to debrief this video at the end. But what I want you to do, your assignment is, if you have a sheet of paper, if not, that's okay. If you can watch the video, it's less than 2 minutes, because it illustrates something. It illustrates what is known as microexpressions. And if you don't know what microexpressions are, they are expressions that are very quick. They're facial expressions. They are a response to a thought process. Internal emotions, they are involuntary. They happen in a blink of an eye, less than a blink of an eye. 20 milliseconds is when they happen. So I want you to, each scene in this less than 2 minute video, I want you to try to find those micro expressions and just ponder that on your own while you're watching it, and think about it as you go on through your life. So lawyer Isaac Wright said, if you don't see yourself in someone else's pain, you will not do anything about it. It's important for us to be able to visualize someone else's pain, to be empathetic, because if we can't do that, then we lose something in how we relate to others. So the question is, where does it begin? How does a system become biased, and how does players become biased? Well, there's a couple of things that happen. Not in any particular order, but they do happen. So first, we have to understand the concept of institutional racism, which is really just the normalization, the legitimization of an array of dynamics, whether they be interpersonal, institutional, cultural, that routinely advantages whites by producing cumulative and chronic adverse effects, outcomes to people of color. Oftentimes, players within this in this system or within this process sees a person, a marginalized person, as inferior, or see themselves as superior. Then we have what is known as racism. So racism is just a prejudice, discrimination against a person or people on the basis of their membership. That's typically, again, these are marginalized people. And then we have explicit bias, which is explicit bias is something that you endorse on a conscious level. You know it's wrong or may believe that it's wrong and still do it despite that. And then really what we're going to talk about today in the next couple of minutes, in the short time that I have you, implicit bias. So again, what is this thing called implicit bias? And why do we need to talk about it? Well, implicit bias, based on the North Carolina Commission on Racial Ethnic Disparities, NC Create, and if you have an opportunity, please visit that website. They talk about implicit bias as an unconscious, it could be positive or negative, mental attitude toward a person, an object, or a group. There's significant research that's showing that we all are influenced by these unconscious biases and that they can actually dictate our behavior without our approval or even without our awareness. It's based on our history, how we were raised, the people we associate ourselves with, and it can be, again, unconscious and unknown to us. Again, it's based on who we hang out with. So there are different types of biases too. So the first bias is like me bias. So like me bias is basically we hang out with people who have similar backgrounds, who look like us. They can be from church groups. They can be from the military, fraternities, churches, gender, sexual orientation, sororities. So again, we gravitate, and it's natural for us to gravitate to these people, but we limit ourselves when that's our only exposure. The next one is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is that bias that we only listen to information that confirms our preconceived notions. An example is when we watch TV and we turn off that news station because we don't like the type of news that they're sharing. So, and now today in the age of technology aids in our bias. And how technology does that is if you go on your computer and you start typing, you're looking for shoes or you're looking for a t-shirt. When you go to your phone, you go to Facebook, it shows up on your feed. It shows up on your timeline. So you can go to Instagram, you can go to Twitter, and it shows up on your feed almost instantaneously. I mean, there's a lot of fear about how instant that is. But again, it only confirms what we know. Again, our bias is based on history. Our bias is based on our own searches. Our bias is based on the groups that we hang out with. And then the final one I'm going to talk about, now there's many different types of biases. These are the three main ones. The last one is anchoring bias. That's when your mind anchors to the first piece of information that you're given about a subject. A good example is I remember when I was in the military, I was a substance abuse counselor. And I had a group of people in a counseling session. We had a group session going on. And one of the individuals was 19 years old. And he was there because he had a DWI, driving while under the influence. And at the time in North Carolina, all you had to have is a BAC, not all you had to have, because a BAC of 0.08 is legally drunk. But this person blew a 0.43. He was 5 times past the legal limit. And he wore that like a badge of honor. He was also sharing his story about his drinking history. And when he was a kid, back when you can go to a convenience store and buy alcohol without being carded, he would go to the store because his mom would send him. And his mom would send him to the store to get 2 cases of beer, one for him and one for her. So he would bring mom's case back to her. This is probably before he even turned teenage years. And he would drink his case of beer on his own and blow right through it. Now, when we're in this group session, everybody from different ages, different backgrounds was looking at him, and they were giving him the business. And in counseling, you kind of let some of that go on because the group can sometimes correct themselves. But he looked at me for confirmation to almost normalize his behavior. And the only thing I can say to him was, who am I? And him and the other group members were perplexed, asking me, what do you mean by that? And I just shared with him, who am I to tell you to stop drinking when the person you love and care for the most, that raised you, said that it was okay? Who am I? And that's the same thing with bias. When you look at people who have shows generational bias based on what they were taught, it's hard for us to, it's easy for us to be angry, but it's hard for us to take a step back and say, hey, this came from somewhere. But we owe it to them and we owe it to ourselves to do that. Because blasting someone on social media from a far, far place away is not going to solve the issue, but constant or conscious conversations will. So if we know that these biases exist, how do we deal with them? How do we deal with our own bias? How do we deal with other people's bias? And there's ways to do that. There's processes that we can do, even as leaders, as organizational leaders, we can deal with our own biases and deal with biases within the cultures within our organization. But one of the ways is becoming aware, and that's the most courageous thing you can do, is become aware of your own bias. One way is, and there's several different types of bias testing that are out there. I specifically took the Harvard Implicit Bias Test, the IAT bias test, and I was shocked at my own biases. I was literally blown away by my own biases. The interesting thing is, once you know your biases, you can minimize its effect on how you deal with people on a day-to-day basis. But this was implemented, the Harvard Implicit Bias Test, and this is probably the first one. It was implemented in the late 1990s. It was a gauge to try to understand implicit attitudes, identities, beliefs, and biases people are unwilling and unable to report. So once you know those, you're able to deal, again, research shows that you're able to mitigate the effects of your own bias. Because we all have biases. We can't change that. But it's based on information. It's based on you seeking the information. And you must know that the absence of information is the absence of the truth. And somebody else's information may not be the truth. You need to open yourself up to different possibilities, exposure to places, things. A couple of years ago, I gave myself a New Year's resolution that I would actually do volunteer work. And I would do 2 types of volunteer opportunities a month for the whole year. And I ended up doing 26. And it was based on, I found it, even though it was hard, it was easy because at the time I was involved in an organization that do a lot of volunteer work. It was Florida Council on Crime and Delinquency. And I did 26 volunteer events, which really enlightened my awareness, especially about the homeless, that I am no different than these people, as if these are these people. I was no different than the person. They were also veterans. They also served in the military. They also was affected by PTSD. There was several things that were going on with them that may not be the exact things that were going on to me, but I could certainly relate from an economic point of view all the way to their present experiences. So exposure, going to different places. And I traveled all over the world, and I thought I thought I was impervious to bias. And that was the fallacy in that thought. And then find out your triggers. Again, once you take a bias test, once you understand what your biases are, try to equate that to a trigger. Those situations where you're most likely to become biased. And then when you know that, you can slow down. And then you can actually process it before it actually affects that decision making. And then seek feedback. You have to create an environment that allows your team to discuss situations that may appear biased. The interesting thing is when you're trying to sell something to someone who do not look like you, it is easy to trample on their respect. Corporations do it all the time. So you have to create an environment of inclusion. And you have to have an implicit bias approach. This is where you ask the righteous question, how do I get my actions and behaviors congruent with my consciously stated beliefs? Because as I know, my implicit bias is unknown to me. So therefore, it could be damaging my reputation, and everybody around me knows this, but I am totally oblivious to it. We also must acknowledge the system in which we operate in. I don't care what system it is. It could be the healthcare system. It can be the job market. It could be the financial market, housing, education, and media, just as Max talked about. But these systems all suffer from structural biases, institutional racism, which research shows adversely affect people of color at every turn. So we must acknowledge that. But we also must acknowledge this, and that is not everybody that's working in those institutions are out to kill people as soon as they get in a vehicle and they're sworn to protect. Not every Black person is violent. So if you believe one, you have to believe the other. And the truth is both of those are incorrect. Media plays a big part in how our perceptions run. But we have to acknowledge the structure, and if we acknowledge the structure, we can make changes. And we have to acknowledge that the stewards that work within those structures mainly are honorable people who really want to do the good work. They don't go into these systems that pay low pay just so they can get themselves a paycheck, because that is a redundancy there. But they do work in those systems so they can provide the just work for the people that they work with. So what does all this mean? It means that we do have a plan to reduce our bias, but we have to be stewards within those organizations that we work with and encourage things such as implicit bias, because that is the foundation that research says that if you have an implicit bias approach, that approach in dealing with your own biases and helping others deal with their own biases can affect explicit bias, which in turn can have an effect on racism. And those two in itself can deal with policies, immediate action with policies and cultures within an organization. And then with a collaborative effort can lead to us making, and I do mean us, making suggestions about legislative change that can fix some of the issues with structural racism. So what did we just talk about in this short time? Well, actually, we talked about defining bias, and we discussed the different types of bias. We also talked about learning ways to recognize some behaviors that may suggest bias and differential treatment. We actually kind of did a self-exercise where we looked at micro expressions, and we talked about the biases that may affect us. We learned some techniques that can help us de-bias perceptions, improve our interactions as leaders and as stewards and working with our own peers within our organizations. We did this understanding that the conversation has to continue. We did this understanding that we're in a place in time that we have never been in, even though we've had racial conflict under every administration since the birth of this country. We're in a position today where there's more conversations and there's more collaborative effort regarding people of color, Black, white, Latino, LGBTQ, you name it, Muslim Americans, everyone is coming together to try to solve this problem. And everybody is seeking the same thing, which is equality. How we get there is based on how we're willing and how courageous we are in bridging the discussions and changing them from hate speech, from hate rhetoric on social media to just collaborative conversation. Guys, I really appreciate you giving me this opportunity to speak with you. And at this moment, I'm going to actually just turn it back over to the moderator.
Thank you, Assistant Chief Bowler. That was an incredible presentation. And as many of the folks in the chat, a long overdue conversation that FACC is bringing and leading. At this moment, I would really like to ask John McMahon and Michael Anderson to turn on their video. They will lead us in a question and answer session with the speakers, who I also invite to turn on their mics and videos so that we could move along and get some of these important questions answered.
Hey, good morning. The first question we have from the group: what are some actionable ways to give back to the African American community in the United States for the things they have done for our country? Are financial reparations the only way?
Let me take part of that, because I think Max may have some information on that as well. And I think we have a coalition of folks, because I know some of the folks that's on this call, that probably can say some of the same things or even more that I'm saying, but I will tell you first, you have to recognize the history. You have to put it in history books. People have to know that this exists. I was a grown man, and I served 20 years in the military before I found out what was in the third stanza of our own national anthem. So, I would just add that it has to be in history books, and then we have to normalize it. We have to not just berate people for the conversation. We have to encourage a conversation that has a coalition of folks. And also in corporate America, we have to allow people who look like people that they're selling to be a part of the decision-making process. So that would be my feedback.
So my feedback along the line of what Omar just stated, I truly believe that history is very important. Changing the narrative is very important. You can't watch cowboys and Indians and believe that this is the way it was. Indians were not bad. We actually took their land away from them and slaughtered a lot of them. And once you do that, I do believe that economic and financial reparation is in order so that everybody is back into an equal footing. Because I personally, I can tell you, I am tired of hearing, why aren't your people doing better? What do you mean, why aren't we doing better? I'm tired of people not recognizing the fact that you criminalize people of color, but criminality really started in the system of slavery. And so you have to look at how criminality has been used to fund a lot of economic situations in this country, right? The southern states, if it wasn't for taking blacks off the street, which they did impunitively all the time so that they could have a budget that they could use, they sold them out. They loaned them out to banks, to the railroad, to all of these places. They never came back to their families. You've got to take back and say, hey, we destroyed Sanford. We took away the Black Wall Street. We did all these things. That stuff has value. So yes, understand history, redefine it again, and be truthful about what has happened and how you have benefited all these years from all these things. And you cannot just hand me, something to go to a school, you're going to pay for it. And I'm just one person. That doesn't change the entire narrative and an entire group of people for all of these years.
John, Mike, any additional questions?
Sorry about that. Thank you very much for your responses. Here's another one. What are some strategies that can be implemented in the workplace to reduce bias, and how do we reach those people? Oh, sorry. Questions are popping in as I'm reading them. Let me read that again. What are some strategies that can be implemented in the workplace to reduce bias and gain understanding?
So this is Max. So from the workplace, I think it starts with leadership, right? And we have to redefine what leadership means, right? Because a lot of people think that because you're in a position of power, that makes you a leader. No, a leader is someone who listens, who takes in an entire group of people, looks at what their strengths and weaknesses are, actually have that conversation with them and give them the opportunity, absent, right, of their race and their color. Leaders don't do that, right? They pick who they like. If they look like me, I'm going to give you all these opportunities, and you create dissension. Have that conversation, hold classes. There are multiple ways of having this discussion in training and making sure that it's being exhibited within the workplace, right, in the way that people are being treated. If somebody comes to you and say, hey, I'm not being treated right, don't vilify them. Don't make them the enemy. You got to sit down and listen to what's going on. And perhaps even the leader or the person in position doesn't understand how some of these things are affecting people. Have historical training. What's wrong with that? I mean, schools are very important. Learning and reading, it's a very important thing. I encourage everyone to go out and buy a book called Slavery by Another Name. It really takes you all the way to today and looking at how things have really have a need to change from within the institutional structures that we have today.
How that happened.
So I would just add that we do too much training for frontline staff and not enough for executive staff. So I think in order to ensure that leadership is leading the best way, the most honorable way, is that we have to train our executive staff, our supervisory staff. And that training has to be a training that sponsors inclusiveness, that sponsors implicit bias, because if you want to change bias, people have to know what bias is and how it looks and how it permeates within the organization. So you have to change that because, again, as a baseline, bias can change, racism, it can change explicit bias. And as a collaborative effect, it can actually change legislative action. So I think that if you want strategies, that's the way to do it.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, what should you do if you are a victim of racism and afraid of retaliation?
That's a very good question. And that's a very personal question is what it is. I think first you should talk to someone about it. As a leader myself, I'm going to say report it because I've reported it before. And I've received retribution as part of me reporting it. But it did change things. So I think it's important to report, and the sooner the better, because you can't let that time lapse. Because the more time lapse, the more it seems like that it didn't occur, or the scrutiny is that it didn't occur. So as soon as it happens, start to let people know. Start to let people know that you want feedback on it. Start to let people know what you desire as an outcome. So, and I would say also, review your reporting strategies within your organization, because some of them have people that you can report those specific actions to. So reporting issues related to bias and racism is one person, reporting something else maybe to another person. But I think it's important to report it, and I think it's important to use your chain of command to do so.
I will say, this is Max, that I agree with Omar. It depends. It's a very personal decision because there's so many things you have to think about, right? And a lot of time, I will say, and I don't mean this in a bad way, most humans, I don't want to use the word cowardly, but most people are afraid, right? And that's why it's so easy to manipulate an entire population. And then a lot of it has to do with economics and finances, right? So depending on where you are in the structure, it becomes more and more difficult. But I will say this, because I've been one of those radicals, and I have, filed certain things. You got to have your facts straight, documented well, day, time, who was around, etc. You can't go by feelings, right? You can't say I've been treated X, Y, and Z, and you really can't point to anything. You really have to come with your book, or come with your notes, come with your facts, and then stand up. Because if you don't, who's going to do it for you? right? Somebody else may end up doing it for you, or you end up getting more and more frustrated, and it's going to show in other ways. Again, agreed, look at what your company or organization's reporting structure is, how they really look at these things, because a lot of stuff is on paper just to satisfy governmental requirements. Doesn't necessarily mean that anybody takes it seriously or that they do anything about it. I can tell you, like in places I've worked, a lot of people would never go to HR and report anything. Why? Because they were very good friends with the president or the city manager or whatever the case might be. So it was just there, but it wasn't really being utilized for the purpose that it was. But report it if you can, and if you can deal with the repercussions that will come your way. Trust me, absent losing your job, because some places actually get rid of people who complain about things or report things that are improper, immoral, or whatever the case might be.
So, and I would just add, just to flip the script for a moment, you may report something and it may not be what you think it is. So really seeking information may clarify what it is. And I'm not saying that it may have not happened, but what I'm saying is your interpretation of the policy may be incorrect. So that's just the other side of it.
Very true.
To the presenters here, another question. From your work, do you know if implicit bias training is being discussed in organizations or with community partners? We've had some comments and questions that are organization and agency specific, but from your standpoint, can you elaborate, or from your work, do you know if implicit bias training is being discussed in organizations or with other community partners? Max, Omar?
I can speak from my organization. Well, I can't speak for my organization, but I can share with you what I'm seeing within my organization. The Department of Juvenile Justice is very proactive from a racial, ethnic standpoint. They have had a conference, and they're in the midst of another conference that they've been planning for 2 years, the Florida Race Equity Challenge. They also have had consultants to train staff, and I was one of the people that was honored to be trained to be able to deliver a curriculum to detention folks in a secure environment, and that deliver training to work within a community corrections environment. So, and I've been approached by church groups, I've been approached by law enforcement.
Excuse me, Omar, I hate to interrupt. I'm going to mute you just for a moment. We've got some open mics, and then I'll...
Yeah. Go ahead. Can you hear me? Thumbs up?
You're
All right,
good.
thank you. So I, you know, from that standpoint, I think community partners, based on, you know, current events, they're reaching out to folks who are trained to do this. But, you know, when you give training, there should be follow-up on any training that you give to see its effectiveness. So you can't just train folks and think that it's going to be effective. You have to have some form of measurement. So I would caution people that reach out that they should follow up. Have those uncomfortable conversations, because that will help as well. Have the conversations where you don't penalize folks for their opinion. So I think that's very important. So that would be my answer.
And so I will say I do a lot of volunteer work. And from my company perspective, they've started, I would say, months ago, a series of conversations regarding what's happening politically right now with Black Lives Matter. And they rolled out actually a training that talks about the foundation of racism, systemic injustice, recognizing white privilege, recognizing the role of Black Lives Matter movement, learning from others, what action you could take. And like I mentioned earlier, they've brought in some individuals to come in and actually have roundtable conversation with everyone. Just say what you have to say, put it out on the table. So as employees, you can say, hey, we feel this way. From the organizations that I belong to, I work a lot with women and children and kids. But I do think that you have to educate children on history, right? So we've kind of looked at it from that perspective because kids are fearful, right? If you're still having conversations with your Black child about what to do when a police officer comes near you and all of that, that's ridiculous in this day and age. That should never be happening. What you're doing is you're actually taking away somebody's voice and making them feel less than. And I know institutionally that's probably the way they want it to be. But you have to have these conversations about history with your kids. So in my organization, we've got every day from 5 to 6 or 7 o'clock, different perspective. We just had something on last night on disabled kids, and I learned something new. And disabled adults. I learned about a camp that they started in New York for disabled people, but the parents didn't know what to do with them. They were all races and color, and the way they were ostracized. I mean, you start saying to yourself, oh my God, this is really bad. It could be my kid, or it could be a family member of mine, or somebody in my community. So I think having those conversations and just putting it out there so people understand, you got to step back a little and be as fair as you can be. You're not always going to be, but try to be as fair as you can be.
Max, Omar, as a follow-up, we received a question here that ties into your responses. And it states, are there any suggestions, ideas on how an agency can begin to initiate conversations regarding the issues at hand? Any suggestions?
I would suggest just be open with scheduling meetings, asking for participants that want to be involved in that kind of conversation. So that's number one. And then having a set of rules for the conversation so everybody does have an equal voice, have an opportunity to speak, and their conversation is valued. So I think that, and it's a courageous thing. A person should not be vilified for their opinion, because oftentimes they just have not had that exposure. So as a participant in those conversations, I would ask that if you're going to ask a question about a particular organization, about a particular movement, or about something that you're unsure of, do some investigation about it. So then when you have that conversation, so you do some investigation about it, so you're ready for the conversation, and also be willing and open to whatever answer you hear.
And I would take that one step further. I think, having worked in government myself, right, I will say that as a leader when there are issues in your organization. You hear it in whether it's coffee breaks or you go out with someone. I think you need to document those things and make it part of the conversation. Hey, I understand that this is happening, or people are feeling this way. Start addressing that, right? Training is great, but it's like anything else. I can go to school, I can go to a class, I'm very good at passing tests, I pass the test, I walk away, and that's it, right? Nobody really knows, can I apply what I learned? Can I really use it? They just know I passed. It's the same thing with some of these training things. Everybody walks away, everybody feels good, but what are you doing on the follow-up? So you got to follow up. You have to do what Omar said, but I think you also have to bring to the table the issues that affect your agency, your group, your team that you haven't addressed, that you put under the rug, or you just think it's just a person complaining and, oh my God, everybody knows, right? That's how you kind of start making changes and maybe working to change behaviors.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Somebody asked if there's an assessment that can evaluate levels of implicit bias.
Yes, there's a couple of them. I think Georgetown University has one. I took the Harvard implicit bias test. So those are really the two that I'm familiar with. I'm more familiar with the Harvard implicit bias test because I took this myself. So I would encourage you to consider taking it. I think someone has their video on, but I would encourage you to take it yourself. So those are the ones I'm familiar with.
So that's available online then?
Yeah, it's available online for free. So you can take it, and they use, one of the great things is it's anonymous, but they use the information to validate the tool.
Okay. Max, you have anything to add to that?
I remember when they used to do assessment with kids and adults on how they feel about particular people. Those things are still done. I don't know outside of the realm of what I do if there's an assessment for implicit bias. I can tell you that my organization has done some surveys and people have, supposedly answered honestly. So you have to always be concerned about that. Are you really answering it honestly, or are you just, answering what you think they want you to answer? So I'm always very leery about these things because I never know what's true or not in terms of what I'm, analyzing. But I don't have anything that I can say, hey, go here. This would be something that you could do.
Thank you.
Next question sent via chat. Max or Omar, how do you change the mindset of those in the workplace that have it in their mind that they are too old to change and believe that this is the way people of color should be treated? And how do you reach those people? Because the question writer indicates, because I'm sure they are not on this training webinar.
Well, go ahead, Max.
Go ahead. Okay, I'm going to say this. There's sometimes you can't change a person. I mean, you can try putting facts. 60 Minutes just did a fantastic documentary. I forgot the young man's name that went. It had to do with monuments, taking these monuments down in different southern states and locations. And they were talking to some older people that have been around since whatever. And no matter what you would say to those people, they truly believe the statues mean something and that blacks are better off in the end being here than in Africa. How do you change that mindset? When they, it's so institutionalized in them. I think that you talk to somebody and you ask them, why do you feel that way? What has led you there? And then they may throw something out at you. If historically, you've got some facts, you could say, oh, but you check this. In 1980, this happened, this was a decision. Now they have a choice of saying, oh, that's not true, or telling you it doesn't really matter, my mind is set. So I think it's a very individual thing. You got to navigate how the person feels, and, they're older, and not to say that older people can't change. They do change. Obviously, you should be evolving as a human being. But if they can't, there's nothing you can do. We cannot change everybody. You can only change the person who's willing to listen. And even when they listen and learn something new, they still may retain the way they feel. They may say, oh, I get it. That's true, but you know what? I still feel this way. And you're never going to change my mind. Then you walk away and go to the next person who you will be able to change.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think you have to change yourself and not make yourself responsible for changing them. So that's number one. You need to be okay with the fact that you may not change them. But if you operate by your own self with the mindset of equity and inclusivity, that tends to reverberate. So I think, one, you got to make it not your responsibility to change that person. You have to still operate yourself as you think you should operate. So leave it to someone else, leave it to God.
Okay, the next question is, can you give an example of instructional racism?
I think that's institutional racism.
Well, it says instructional, but I guess they meant to say institutional. I didn't know what it meant either, right?
So I think institutional race, a good example is the one that Max gave. Again, school fundings come from property taxes. So if you live in a wealthy neighborhood, those property taxes will be much larger than the property taxes in a low economic area, so to speak. So what that means is teachers have a higher level of education. The school ratio, the student to teacher ratio is lower. You have better instruction equipment, which translate to better outcomes. You also have more extracurricular activities. Again, research shows that translates to better outcomes. So I think that's a clear example of institutional racism. Another example would be back in the 80s when they had crack versus cocaine. You know, you can get caught with 1 gram of crack and get 1 gram equals 5 years, but you would have to have 500 grams of cocaine to get that same time. But crack was associated with Black people and cocaine was associated with upper white class people. So those are, I think, 2 examples, criminal justice example and a school example of institutional racism.
I will say also, Omar, I do believe that there is instructional racism, right? And people would say, well, what the heck is that? Perfect example, I'm just going to go back to, I always like to go back to people that people can relate to. Malcolm X is a perfect example of an individual that was brilliant, was also born in Omaha, Nebraska, and was very bright, went to a school that was predominantly white in the area that he was in. And when he indicated that he wanted to be an attorney, the teacher looked at him and says, that's not a realistic goal for and use the N-word. Okay, now that sticks in the mind of a child, right? So now, from an educational perspective, how do you move from there? Because already they're telling you that you're a failure. My niece was a teacher here in the United States, and she's been teaching abroad now for the past 6 years. Why? Because she started teaching at the middle school level. And she would go to meetings where they're already planning, even at the lower level, planning jails for Black kids. So part of the discussion was how many of these kids would end up in jail. Who does that? How about planning for what's going to be best for them in terms of what they like to do? They may be the next inventor, whatever the case might be. And she got frustrated. She's 30 years old and decided, I can't teach in America. I will rather teach abroad. And that's what she does. And it's a shame because she's very good at what she does, but she couldn't understand this whole scenario of how we're planning educationally for our children.
Thank you, Max. I think we've got time for one more. Let me try to get this in, and I'll pose it to the presenters again. Aside from trainings, how do you change the culture of any department or organization when the mindset has been ingrained deeply into these entities for generations? And then the follow-up question to this, many people don't realize that they're a part of the problem, and many people know that they are, but don't seem to care. Mm-hmm. Omar, you want to?
Yeah, I'll start. I think cultural change takes time. You can't ask for, because there's so many people that's involved in departments and even at a unit level, it takes time. So it's a long game. This discussion about implicit bias, it's a long game. We have to continue the conversation beyond this Zoom call to make it, reach other folks outside of this call. So we share what we learn, we share what we talk about. But within an organization, some organizations based on the leadership will not change. Again, you have to give that to the leadership, and you have to operate as a good steward within yourself and advance yourself. That may even mean that you may have to advance out of that organization. That's a decision, that's a personal decision, but nonetheless, when organizations have a sense of inclusivity, they reduce turnover. So it behooves organizations to have a mindset of inclusivity, to include things such as implicit bias training, to include things such as training their leaders from leadership at the same time that they're training their line staff. So if I was to answer that question, I would say it's, your decision to stay within an organization is a personal decision. But I think organizational change, culture change takes time. Now you have to look at those who are running the organization because they may have a strong desire to change. And that's change the culture within an organization. So that's also a question that you can ask your leaders within the organization. How do you plan to address some of these things that's going on in society right now? And some of them are planning, or some of them have a plan to do that.
I think this is very interesting because it plays right into some of my own experiences as a leader or as an employee reporting to other people. I think sometimes you have to look at yourself, right? And you have to learn to chill. When I say chill, I mean listen and then find a way to get people engaging. I learned that the hard way as I was moving up in my career, right? I never wanted my people to think that I had favorites, right? So I kept it strictly business. And then I realized, most people like all these things, right? So I started doing with the ladies, we would do once a week, we'd go and play golf half the day with everyone. We would then do bowling. We'd have certain events so people could interact and talk about things. We would address issues that came up within the group that wasn't addressed and allowed people to, hey, state what you wanted to state. It wasn't going to mean anything bad. And also look at how you can develop a person. A lot of times we look at individuals, I'm not going to do anything. I just don't like their attitude. Or the person is black, white, pink, or yellow. You already have decided I'm only going to do X. You know what? I think sometimes when you make a significant bringing the bread forward, right? The person gets so shocked that they turn around and they start seeing not only you, but maybe your group or your organization differently. I did it, I was out of the union. I was a high-level manager running an organization, and they hated. First of all, it was mostly men, white men, so here I am. That was the problem, and they didn't trust management at all. And one young lady got sick, and I called the limo service for her. And I had the limo service take her home, told her to stay home as long as she wanted to, and when she was ready, I'll have the limo service bring her back. Do you know that all of those people could not believe that I had done that? They were so surprised that they were being treated like human or respect, or I didn't really look at who they were. I looked at the fact that if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't be where I am. That changed the entire conversation relating to management, race, union, respect. That one act did it. And sometimes it just takes one little act that you may think no one is paying attention to, and that can make that change.
Can I just add one more thing? I love what's going on in the chat. So if you're not paying attention to that chat, you need to look at that. Some of your answers are there. All right, that's all I wanted to say.
You're absolutely right, Omar. The chat has been great. Mindful questions, mindful discussion. You all have done an incredible job in answering them directly and helping us bring this, as many of the folks in the chat have noted, a long overdue conversation to the table. So I want to really thank our speakers today for collaborating with FACC and launching our Courageous Conversations. It is my sincere hope that each of you are able to receive this information and engage with us in the journey for change. I noted so many questions about how we change the mindsets of others. I really want to reinforce what our speakers said today. and hope that we can proceed our dialogues with the focus of changing ourselves. And rather than focusing on changing someone's mind, we help them to better understand our perspective and seek to understand theirs. It is no doubt that these are difficult conversations. This is difficult to recognize the parts of ourselves, the parts of our system, the parts of our nation that have led us here. But as we've heard today, if we move past that safe space and get comfortable with the uncomfortable, we can move onward and expect some real change. The goal should always be to be better, right? Change occurs in that place where we overcome that uncomfortable feeling and move forward. We hope that today marks the beginning, that each of you can take one small action and continue the dialogue within your own space. Reach out to one person with a different perspective and openly ask questions and learn and receive. And if you're a leader of an organization, as we've seen in that chat where folks are asking for change and asking for dialogue, we hope that you take this one step further and open that door to a transparent and honest and open dialogue where we could safely continue these courageous conversations in a smaller and more strategic way. I want everyone to please save the date for part 2 of this series, Conversations for Change, Who Move My Lens. We'll be bringing you a panel discussion that will take us beyond implicit bias, move us onward. We hope that many of the questions that we weren't able to answer here, all at the time, we know that we have some more and more questions and we wish we had more time today to explore those, but we'll be feeding those to the next panel. We encourage and empower all of you to continue to submit those to us by email. I'm going to be adding my email to the chat. Any of you can feel free to email me with questions, topics that you want us to perhaps look at the next panel or in a future series and trainings. I want to really thank again the speakers, thank all of you, and hope to see you here for future sessions so we continue this meaningful discussion and need to change. The next, save the date for August 28th right here on Zoom for our next panel discussion. Again, thank you so much for being here today, and see you soon. Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.